What is Learning Zulu, A Secret History of Language in South Africa? The book explores the psychopolitics of language with a particular emphasis on the dynamics of envy as they arise in the history of Zulu and in the history of learning Zulu. Here, Melanie Klein's theorizations of envy play a decidedly central role in Mark's readings, not only of key texts in South African literature, but of a range of materials, including provocatively, as the book draws to a close, Zulu newspaper columns in and around the time of the xenophobic attacks against immigrants in South Africa that took place in 2008. As I read this description, I realize that I'm only touching on some of the most obvious aspects of Mark's book. For Mark has written one of those books where as soon as you come up with a capsule summary, you realize you've left out huge swaths of other things that the book also attends to, other things that it brings within its scope. I should say that Mark describes his book at one point early on, and I had to go back to it to remember, but it's provocative, so I'll mention it, as written in the mode of a familiar essay, and with psychoanalysis working as a break on the authority of the confessional or personal of the truth claims of the stories I tell myself about myself. To be sure, Zulu is there on every page. We learn of books, the Zulu English Dictionary, first published in 1861, and in the 20th century, a book titled Learn More Zulu, which Mark reads with extraordinary care. And yet alongside Zulu, there are a number of meditations taking place in the book, perhaps chief among them, meditation on teaching and teachers. We hear of teachers who instruct Mark in Zulu, but also of other teachers. Klein herself emerges as a kind of teacher, offering up a way of entering the history of learning Zulu and what Mark calls his own implication in that history. I just want to read an instance of this implication in the book because I think it gives a sense of the narrative quality at work. This is from page 63. Mark writes, "One learns and then one thinks that one knows. Is it possible in all rigor to speak or write without claiming to know, or even to know better? There have been times when I have, imagining I know more of the language than them, assuming toward my race-kin the air of superiority and election hardly different from what one discovers in Colenso and other missionaries of his era. Learning Zulu seeks to emphasize learning, and that means relinquishing the profession to know knowledge if it connotes moral superiority. One may attempt to make good, but finally one cannot make oneself good. That is in the hands of the other." Here Mark treats the question of learning Zulu as a nexus of desires and hazards, or again, as the psychopolitical. I'm not entirely sure I agree with Mark here when he says that one cannot finally make oneself good, that this is in the hands of the other. But I find riveting in this instance, as in so many others in his book, his ability to think historically and psychopolitically at the same time. If this is scholarly investigation as implication, it's of a very high order. Identifying a specific and particularly redolent moment, for me at least, in Mark's book also gives me a chance to say one last thing about the book before I hand it over to Emily and Ato, and that is this. Mark brings in another one of his teachers when he writes of the non-coercive rearranging of desire. And it's precisely a non-coercive rearranging of desire that Mark's readings of the history of learning Zulu make available and set in motion. Even as he brings his story up to the present, which is to say, among other things, to the complexities of contemporary South Africa, we have an ethic of non-coercion, of desire that does not atrophy but can yet be rearranged. For that and for much else, my main response to Mark's book is, thanks. I'll introduce Ato and Emily. I don't know, you can decide among yourselves who will go first. But let me go ahead and do the intros, and I'll also introduce Mark more formally, and then we'll begin. Ato Quayson is professor of English and director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Oxford Street, Accra, City Life, The Itineraries of Transnationalism. Also, he's the author of Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability, and the Crisis of Representation. He is the editor or co-editor of a number of works. I'll just mention the Cambridge Companion to the Postcolonial Novel in English from last year, and the Blackwell Companion to Diaspora and Transnationalism. He is here at NYU this year as a visiting professor in the English department. His current project is on postcolonial tragedy. Emily Apter is professor of French and comparative literature at NYU. She is also the chair of comparative literature. She is the author of The Translation Zone, a new comparative literature from 2006, and Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability from 2013. She's also the co-editor with Jacques Lezra and Michael Wood of Dictionary of Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon. She is currently working on a theory of unexceptional politics with the working title Politics Small p, Essays on the Society of Calculation. Mark Sanders is professor of comparative literature here at NYU. Many of you already know about the wide range of subjects that Mark addresses in his work, but they include African literature, literary theory, law and literature, philosophy and literature, South African literature and intellectual history, testimony, autobiography, ethics, psychoanalysis. His books include Complicities, The Intellectual and Apartheid, The Ambiguities of Witnessing, Law and Literature in a Time of Truth, in a Time of a Truth Commission. He's also written on J.M. Coetzee, who shows up a couple of times in his new book. With that, I will hand it to Emily or Ato.
Well, thanks to Jay, to Jane, to Mark, to Ato. It's a nice end-of-term event to be part of. And I'm going to begin with with a tribute to a friend, Srinivas Arabamudan, who I'm sure some of you know, who published his richly researched and critically adventurous book, Guru, English, South Asian Religion in a Cosmopolitan Language, in the same Princeton Transnation series that I've been editing and in which Mark's book appears. A professor of English and Romance Studies and Dean of the Humanities at Duke, Srinivas passed away on April 13th. He was only 54, but he left a body of work with particular influence on those working across theory and postcolonial studies. Guru English, published in 2006, cut through the history of Orientalism and imperialism along a theo-linguistic, transidiomatic axis. Srinivas developed the notion of what he called theosophistics to unpack a grammatology of religion. And I would say that in a complementary vein, Mark Sanders' learning Zulu cuts through mythic constructs of Zuluness and the history of African national languages along the axis of a psychopolitics of language learning. In writing his narrative about a globally exported form of Indian English, a hybrid of Hindu and Buddhist idiolects coded as universal spirituality, Srinivas Arabamudan grappled autobiographically with a complex formation that straddled his Brahmin upbringing and education in Catholic schools in India. Sanders, on the other hand, discovers in the challenge of studying Zulu his own case history. Taking up Zulu, Ulimi Webele, I wish I could pronounce it, itself a language that calls to the breast in the name of the mother tongue. Sanders discovers a psychic past haunted by jealousy, fear of abandonment, hostility to part objects, and the Kleinian instigation of the drive toward Wiedergutmachen, to make good again. And here I think Jay and I are echoing each other. In Natuli's radio play, he discovers the story of a man confronted by a father who had long ago abandoned his family. The old man asks his son for forgiveness. This play in Zulu embarks Sanders on a confrontation with the story of his own adoption and the difficult blank of his unknown bio-father. Zulu language learning is a therapy. Sanders writes, "The unconscious employs the language newly being learned in order to work its way through and around inhibition," end of quote. Movingly then, both Guru English and Learning Zulu are predicated on novel ways of thinking autobiographically about language as techne, that is, as didactic apparatus, an extended arm of colonial discursive regimes, and as a graveyard of agonistic contradictions, where reparation and redemption alternate with ungrievable wounds and intractable persecution complexes. Zulu, spoken as a first language by 11.5 million South Africans, becomes far more than the name of a language in Mark's book. It stands in as a term for systems of language learning that place obstacles in the way of learning Zulu for Sanders, a white South African. Learning Zulu will be an act of reparation for a foundational violence built into South Africa's violent heritage of colonial oppression and apartheid. But it will also reveal that no such reparation is possible. Zulu will put him on trial as a white South African, always already collusive in the production of subjects of colonial violence. In what struck me as one of the most painful, morally compromising admissions found in the book, we read, I can make reparation by learning the language, but at any time, I can also lapse into a paranoia in which I feel myself persecuted by the language itself, and to be sure, by its speakers. The language becomes my persecutor and prosecutor for wrongs that, although I am an accomplice, because they are not mine, but those of a multitude, dead, living, and unborn, I can never set right on my own. The easy slippage between the words persecution and prosecution invites new conjugations of psychoanalysis and the law, producing strange inventions of, say, a prosecution complex, which is brought out in the French expression je fus traduit en justice, meaning literally I was brought to justice or prosecuted in a court of law, but which suggests more subliminally I was violently translated, or translate prosecutes me. We could equally well play around with the idea of a witness to the persecution, suggesting participant observation of the kind of persecution mania unleashed by criminal disavowal and the pent-up fury of secret hate. Guilt is abreacted, emotionally discharged, yet rather than being cathartically purged, it produces a syndrome akin to Derridian autoimmunity, in which the subject discovers itself as supreme allergen or toxin. The experience of auto-disaffection means that any effort of disculpation becomes an exercise in self-incrimination. The crime is the byproduct of an anterior sense of guilt. The unconscious is always already a fount of shame. How does one work through this syndrome, which is inextricable from the historical trauma of enslavement, forced labor, human parks, and violent subjective expropriation? Must one unlearn English or Afrikaans to learn Zulu? At the very least, it would seem to entail the work of linguistic self-dispossession in the white Muttersprache, the renunciation of a first language that guaranteed unquestioned entitlements, the right to home ownership, to territory in a national place, the right to have rights in a legal system constructed on laws of apartheid. Sanders' secret history of Zulu is, at its most personal, a history of giving up the proprietary right to language, of disavowing that ownness or eigenness which nestles in banal claims to having a language or possessing a native tongue. One of the secrets to learning Zulu involves relearning the rural, studying the trials of colonial mimicry to which the houseboy had to submit, rereading protest writing. Learning Zulu also involves becoming acquainted with recent storylines that accentuate the identification of the language with Zulu-ness, archetypes of ethnic power and masculinity, unwelcome new narratives of exclusion and othering. Recent migrants who flunk the shibboleth test by pronouncing Zulu with a foreign accent are now increasingly denied claims to residency and citizenship. So part of Zulu's secret history will extend to immigrant policing and the latest iterations of ethnic separatism. Learning Zulu solicits comparison with a classic yet relatively obscure essay in the domain of comparative literature that I helped recirculate in the public domain. Titled Learning Turkish, the essay was composed in rudimentary Turkish by the European philologist Leo Spitzer in 1934 and published in a Turkish journal, where it was unearthed by one of my former PhD students, Tulay Atak. Her English translation of the essay appeared in PMLA in 2011. Learning Turkish, like learning Zulu, reads like an analytic case history, written as it was during the author's exile to Turkey after he was fired as a result of the Nuremberg laws. Supported by Ataturk, Spitzer worked at the University of Istanbul to establish the first discipline of comparative literature, making language learning, including modern Turkish and its vernaculars, the linchpin of a global, if still highly Eurocentric, curriculum. Spitzer compared learning Turkish to learning to ski at an advanced age, an experience at once exhilarating and humiliating. His piece invites being read in turn with Edward Said's 2002 Living in Arabic. Both essays bring out the common ground between living in and learning how to be in language. Both define the singularities of expressionism that form the grooves of untranslatability in a given language, including idiosyncrasies of syntax and grammar, shifting moods and modes of cognition. For Spitzer, Said, and now Sanders, language is a cognitive inscription, a painful one, as it is situationally inflected by language fear, itself borne along by the political history of linguistic imperialism, exilic dislocation, theopolitical secularism, and the hauntings of philological nationalism. In Learning Zulu, Sanders examines what it means to be or not to be in language, what it means to fall in and out of a language as one might fall in and out of love, or into the chokehold of colonial language politics. For it is impossible to learn Zulu for a white South African without entering into its history as a colonial language, vehicularized by missionaries, and hierarchically elevated above Kitchen Kafir or Fanagolo, a Zulu-based lingua franca inflected by English syntax and Afrikaans. Who and what is Zulu? We can answer this factually, and Sanders' book helps us. Zulu is one of 11 official languages spoken in South Africa. It belongs to the family of Nguni and Bantu languages. It is a language that lends itself to poetic enunciation. If you YouTube Zulu, you are directed to tutorials on how to pronounce it as a click language. You turn up mesmerizing spoken poetry with Christian messages set to Simon and Garfunkel's Sound of Silence. You uncover Zulu rap battles and vintage performances by Zulu Boy and Zola, as well as contemporary hip-hop in Zulu. These encounters might almost make you forget its struggles against Afrikaans and English. Sanders has no intention of letting you forget. If Zulu is being learned in this book, if it is to be learnable by a white South African, then part of that learning process will involve reliving and releasing the raced microaggressions of its ongoing usage by both the author and by its communities of speakers the world over. Learning Zulu is a book about translation. Not only does it introduce the reader to phrases in Zulu, not only does it move back and forth between Zulu idioms and their English non-equivalents, it also translates language effects psychoanalytically and naturalizes as a set of techniques, and naturalizes translation as a set of techniques coextensive with psychoanalytic method. Analyzing the politics, often hostile to new immigrant forms of Zulu speech, of OEHM Nuksumalo, thank you, who co-authored with, how do you pronounce his name, Nimbezi?
Nimbezi.
Thank you.
Nimbezi.
A valuable Zulu dictionary, and became himself a distinguished translator of Zulu texts. Sanders writes, although thoughtful and erudite, I can't pronounce it, Okay, Numalo. Its response to the violence was equivocal and, to me, disturbing even. Whereas he might have given moral and political direction to an implied reader who shared his assumptions about who is answerable for what, he provided me with no clear answers. I would even say that his division between those who are like us and those who are not like us mirrors the white question: are you for Zulu or against it? His answer is that they are against it, the abusers of language, the closers down of the teachers' colleges, those disrespecters of the elderly. This is in effect a paranoid answer, bound up with the envy of the one who succeeds, perhaps learning just enough Zulu to get by, and a projection of envious violence into the latter. And then finally, the import and power for me of this paranoia and its violent acting out, of which I am by no means innocent, as my Zulu fossilizes and my criticisms become less and less relenting, as if I'm trying to please my own fathers and forefathers by taking sides against a language with which I identify the professor, is far more consequential than anything I can find in Nuxalo himself. Okay, conclusion. So this Nuxmalo's struggles to have Zulu spoken rightly, which leads him treacherously into xenophobic thickets and language policing, in some ways parallels Mark Sanders's struggles to correct for his own private autoimmune syndrome. And along the way in this process, we discover a Kleinian translation theory starring envy, jealousy, and the enunciation of a murderous death drive imbricated in historical race and culture wars, interlaced with a specific history of South African apartheid and including its latest forms of linguistic apartheid. Translation, as we know, brings on contention, wars both big and small. We're in the midst of a small one right now, the mini affair prompted by Jeffrey Bennington's Take No Prisoners assessment in the Los Angeles Review of Books of Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's retranslation, or revision, depending on which view you adopt, of Derrida's Of Grammatology. Though it is a sidebar in this evening's discussion, some of the issues raised around translational correctness or rightness, untranslatability, translation interminable, the pitfalls besetting even the best of translators posed by what are called faux amis, false friends, or contresens. These are surely germane to Sanders's agonistic account of the psychic life of language learning, and to the question, the premier question of intercultural subjective knowledge, to be or not to be, to live or not to live in Zulu. That is the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for inviting me to contribute to, talking about your book. As I was reading it, it came to mind the opening epigraph of C.L.R. James's Beyond a Boundary. And the opening epigraph is, what do they know of cricket who only cricket know? What do they know of cricket who only cricket know? And of course, this epigraph is applicable to Mark's book, What Do They Know of Zulu Who Only Zulu Know? Because Mark is a very methodical and patient scholar. The entire argument is conducted around a series of incremental repetitions, both within individual chapters and across the entire book, that help to bind the key propositions of the text. He doesn't make any assertions lightly. His study of the Zulu language, and both Emily and Jay have mentioned this already, his study of the Zulu language is also a form of sentimental education for him and for his readers, not just into the complexities of language learning, but also into the affective payout that attaches to the context of Zulu in South African history, politics, and social relations. The Zulu language teaches him a simultaneous lesson in Purism and hybridity. The two, Purism and hybridity, are dialectically related in his text. Zulu's hybridity is revealed to be not so much the opposite or counterweight to its purity, but rather in terms of its conjunctural interactions with other languages, such as the Pidgin Fandagalo. This is the language that the white historically developed to communicate in the imperative mood to their black servants. And also in relation to Soto and Kosa. You have to forgive us. To Soto and Kosa, for whom the linguistic proximity of their languages to Zulu means that they are always already learning Zulu, whether they are aware of this fact or not. Now, this hybridity brings to mind something that I myself have been mulling over regarding the status of language within multilingual contexts. The fact that each language within a multilingual environment bears an imprint from the various other languages that act as its addressees is something that is not attended to adequately in discussions of multilingualism. Now, this orientation toward addressees goes beyond what sociolinguists describe in terms of code switching, or language one, to get a bit more technical, language one intrusion, as in, say, speaking Zulu with a heavy Afrikaner accent. That's L1 intrusion. Rather, it seems to me what is more interesting is that in a multilingual context, all languages become twice dialogized. First, internally, as in being oriented toward an addressee posed as a historical effect within the language itself, internal to the language, but perhaps now fossilized as an archaism or something archaic, or the mark of an elite class. So the language is dialogized because of the sedimentation of archaisms and also elitisms within the language itself. So that's the internal dialogization. And second, the dialogism is external to the language in the ways in which each language retains a residue of other languages that secrete their own codes into the mother tongue. In fact, the man with the unpronounceable name right. Is quoted by Mark in a very, very fascinating. He quotes Njumalo. Thank you. And this is Njumalo being quoted by Mark Sanders. There are many people, especially in provinces outside of KwaZulu-Natal, who speak the Zulu language. From the way in which they speak it, it sounds like there is another language that they suck from the breast. With others, there is no language that they suck from the breast apart from this variety of Zulu that they speak. This language of theirs mixes with others, neighboring languages, and takes from Xhosa, Swati, and also translates words from Sotho and Afrikaans. That is why you hear words like kanda instead of ikanda, egg, and then he gives a list of other words. There is a differing in thinking between people who say every language that is spoken should be the finest, i.e. the purest, and those who say about people who speak the language that is said to be of Johannesburg or places like the far edges of the Baka country. It is a variety of Zulu. So he is actually, without fully acknowledging it, responding to the fact that the Zulu language, which is his interest, has secretions of other languages or drawing from the multilingual context. But he is a purist policeman, so this irritates him. The attempt at policing dialogism within the multilingual context leads to acts of xenophobia and violence, or in a more abstract way, of the elevation of notions of correctness to the level of a universal that is somehow separated from the material conditions of the production of living languages. In other words, notions of correctness are segregated from the material conditions that animate living languages, which are always already hybridized. So all notions of correctness are ahistorical, but postulate themselves as universal. It is the negative effect of this policing that Mark Sanders exposes for us in the pencil language test imposed upon non-Zulu speakers in the delirious xenophobia that unfolded in South Africa in 2008. Mark Sanders also displays different modalities or codes of discourse. I've already mentioned the careful incremental repetition of propositions. But there's something else that he does. Sometimes he's resolutely forensic in his analysis, such as in chapter 2, where he carefully evaluates Alan Paton's Cry My Beloved Country against Yembezi's own fictional Zulu works, as well as in his translation of Paton. This is a linguist at work, assessing the translation, assessing elisions of the translation, assessing within the context of Alan Paton's very famous novel. I read it as a schoolboy, within the context of language learning, how Alan Paton produces a Zulu language that is non-existent. And very, very forensic, detailed. You can see that this is a master linguist and comparatist at work. We also see the same forensic analytical quality in chapter 4, when Mark is assessing Jacob Zuma's arguments about being 100% Zulu boy in the infamous and frankly sordid defense that Jacob Zuma mounted in the rape case that was brought against him in 2005. At other times, such as in chapter 4, where he focuses on the musical Ipitombi, Mark is conspiratorial, almost inviting the reader to share his doubts about this or that. I'll give you a few examples just for flavor. So I think that chapter is the most riveting he says, for example, so he's gone into Ibitombi, he dresses up as a Zulu kid at school, it's an all-boys school, and he's giving us all they dress up, their mothers prepare the assegai, and so on and so forth. We're with him. And then all of a sudden, on page 78, he says, he springs a surprise, he says, but what was Ipitombi? This is smart. Haven't I told you already? If the show's historical significance were all that needed to be noted, then I have given you all that you need to know, and then some. And then he proceeds to give us the secret history of the show, which is quite another like a page later, he says, it has been a long time since I saw the show. Now he's going to the history of the show. It has been a long time since I saw the show, so forgive me if I use the program and the original cast recording. And so he has this, and this tone, this wink, wink, nudge, nudge, conspiratorial flavoring does not appear in the forensic chapters. Yeah, that's very fascinating to me. Now, let me digress a little bit and contextualize learning Zulu in the general, a particular kind of history of African studies. African studies, the genealogy, shall we say, of African studies. Because the genealogies can be traced to a number of sources, including the heritage African studies of the historically black colleges. The African studies was the African studies of ancient Egypt, of a certain pride, of race pride. That African studies was, that version of African studies was actually quite dominant until the 1950s, when with the Title VI, introduction of Title VI, 1957 or so, the Defense Department started promoting area studies. Middle Eastern studies, African studies, all of them date from that period. And in fact, the Title VI program was in response to Sputnik, because basically the American politicians lost their mind that somehow the Russians had got to space before them. Anyway, the point, one of the effects of the Title VI program was to institute language learning as fundamental to area studies. And all those who were trained under that program were required to immerse themselves in a language. And the language facility showed itself in the kind of works that were produced. I think, for example, of Abner Cohen. Abner Cohen wrote a magnificent book on West African stranger communities, in which he was fully conversant with Hausa, which he had learned in America. Or the kind of language learning that you find, or language facility that you find in Karen Barber, who is famous for speaking Yoruba better than Yorubas themselves. Yorubas ran away from her when she started speaking Yoruba. Now, in certain variants of African studies, more and more now, people study Africa without bothering to study any local language. In fact, they can become very successful. Only just a couple of weeks ago, I was at another book launch of a dear friend of mine, I like him very much, who wrote a book on theater in Ghana. Very, very wonderful book, except that you could tell that he doesn't speak the language of the people that he was describing. So there were moments when he missed a turn. He missed the opportunity to really delve into the layers of meaning. You don't find that missing of turns in Mark Sanders. For example, there's a really wonderful section where, in trying to gloss the term epitombi, he discovers that most commentators, in fact, all commentators on the term, on the phrase, have misinterpreted it. Not only have they misinterpreted it, they have misinterpreted it by way of singularizing, so the word is where is the girl? But actually, the real, and because he knows Zulu, he can produce the real phrase, which has been contracted into epitombi. That actually the question was, where are the girls? And this where are the girls then, 3 minutes, so good. This where are the girls takes him into so this is not just a corrective translation. It takes him into the primal scene of racial desire. Beautiful, beautiful, and he can do this because he really knows the language. The final point I want to raise, though, is a little bit more subtle. It's not fully clear, and it has to do with the question of language learning as a form of reparation. Emily mentioned this. Something that Sanders lays out in the introduction to the book, but which gets incrementally repeated from a variety of directions throughout the text. He comes to this notion of reparation, language learning as reparation, almost serendipitously, partly by hearing the radio play that Emily has already pointed to. However, many pages later, on page 98 to be precise, he also provides another idiomatic expression to encapsulate the rationale for language learning, which in the idiomatic expression translated is, to speak a language is to bite one's tongue. The question I found myself wondering is that why does he elevate the notion of forgiveness, so language learning as forgiveness, as opposed to language learning as biting one's tongue? And what I came to see that was happening is that his language learning as asking for forgiveness allows him, of course, to enter into the personal, the family saga. He loses his father. It's a very fascinating, complex trigger for language learning. But actually, what he's doing is he's performing a very fascinating catachresis. Because the word, and the catachresis turns on the word reparation. Because in South Africa, the word reparation has a particular charge. So even though he has assimilated reparation to language learning as a personal quest to be good, actually what he's proposing, but because he's not a polemicist, because he's an incrementalist and not a polemicist, what he could have done was to say that the humiliation of language learning of learning a language that is not your mother tongue is the only true form of reparation in South Africa. But he's not a polemicist like me. He's an incrementalist. So he doesn't make that point. He rather generates a catachresis, which is, so the catachresis is that the language learning as a form of reparation is a personal quest to find himself, when in fact it is a quest that is required for all of South Africa if they want to really, and by the way, the quest is both for whites and blacks. It's not just a white thing. It's the quest for, is the necessity of seeing yourself in the eyes of the addressee, Jay, to perceive oneself in the eyes of the addressee other. The only way to do that is to learn a language that is not your mother tongue. But he's not a polemicist. Thank you very much.
Wow, well, those were such rich responses, and I know that Mark may have a couple of things to say, so I'll hand it over to him, and then after that we should have some time for questions as well.
Yes, it's easier to respond to outright questions, so perhaps I can find a way of responding to your respective responses to the book, and both of which were extremely thought-provoking, and not to mention extremely flattering. And I'm gratified that you've produced such profound responses and readings to the book. And I'll try to respond to a couple of things, and maybe we can have a more of a conversation, because there's no explicit questions as that I wrote down anyway. So yes, I think. Emily, the point that I underlined, I know is really quite moved by your comparison of my book with Spitzer's essay, Learning Turkish, which I haven't read but have read about through your work. And then the point that you made after that comparison, saying that it's impossible for white South African to learn Zulu without encountering this history, and this history of colonial violence. And this is really is something that I wanted to emphasize, but also I think to emphasize that in the process of learning Zulu, this wasn't necessarily something I fully knew to begin with. That this was something that it took me a while to discover, I think, through listening and through reading, listening to people's question, why are you learning Zulu? Because I'm not the first one to have tried to learn the language. And so I became curious about who had come before me and what their motivations were. And, well, some of them left texts. Colenso's left texts. Other people it did too, and yes, there's no forgetting this, and I think this goes to the mode of presentation of the book, in which Ato you've commented on in such depth that I'm just looking for your formulation here. That
incremental repetition.
The incremental repetition instead of the polemic, because the catachresis, I also like that term, and really in my previous book, which is about the Truth Commission and and one of the chapters is about the reparations policy, I started to become aware of the critical potential of Melanie Klein's work, psychoanalytic work, when thinking about these huge historical processes of making good, which are present from the beginning in Colenso's work. But I think what you are asking me there, perhaps, and perhaps this is a question, and ask you whether this is a question or not, that whether given that incremental nature of the argument and the argumentation, I would be prepared to come to a polemical position on the subject. I don't know if I want to answer that question exactly, or at least answer it without having further interrogation from you and Emily on this matter. So.
Can I say something? Mm-hmm. There was a movement in Toronto, which I ultimately became successful, of setting up what they call an Afrocentric school. Mm-hmm. And the Afrocentric school would teach everything through African black history. Canada has a history of slavery, not very well known, and also black loyalists who moved from the United States after the War of Independence and so on. So it has a black presence, and the idea was that black history is marginalized within the Canadian, which is true. It's very badly marginalized. But so some people got together and they set up an Afrocentric school, which is operating. There was a big newspaper coverage and so on. I am completely opposed to the idea of an Afrocentric school, a monocultural education. Not because it is bad. I'm not opposed to African history being taught to Africans. That's not my point. But I think that without alienation, you cannot know yourself. So I would prefer that they were taught Sophocles or Aristotle. I mean, something so distant from their own experience that in going through, mediating their identities through that experience that is so different from theirs, they'll actually come to know something about themselves. So back to this, the polemic of all South Africans. This is me. I mean, I'm not South African. I can say what I like. All South Africans have to be required to learn a language that is not their mother tongue, so that they are all infantilized. And the process of infantilization, it is the process of infantilization in a culture that has had not just colonialism, but a particular form of concentrated colonial violence. So it's not like colonialism in Nigeria or in Ivory Coast or Senegal. It's concentrated colonial violence of an extensive period. It is only so there's a lot of paranoia, there's suspicion, you see, or envy and so on. The only corrective is to actually say, what is an experience that we can all share? But it's an experience that has to be processual. It's not just the experience of saluting the flag, of supporting Bafana Bafana. That is not the experience that will unify us, or the rugby team. That's not this. Those are some. The experience that will generate the flattening is that we all see ourselves through the eyes of the interlocutor. And the only way to do that is to learn a language that, of course, no one will listen to you, but it doesn't matter. that's what I meant by it. Because what you are doing is suggesting that humiliation, infantilization, is teaching you something about yourself as a white South African that, had you not done this, you would not have known. Why not generalize it, not just for white South Africa, but all South Africans? That's what I meant. And
I would build on that by emphasizing that language learning is like encountering a material medium. It isn't just something abstract. And that's why when I was reading your book, I realized I had to take one of these online tutorials on how to pronounce it. I couldn't. I was terrible at it. But I wanted to hear it. And I mean, I did have that experience. I studied a Mayan language, which is a glottal stop language, and where I had no roots whatsoever to hold on to. And that is So I'd say even beyond just learning another language, learning a language where you don't have some sort of false friends or, kind of philological crutch or family of languages, where you're really going out on that limb and breaking it. And it gives you this sense of using other parts of your body. So there's this whole embodied part as well, which, if anything, I would have, in an additional chapter or maybe in some future article, blog post to talk a little bit more about the experience of learning language as something embodied, as something physically, self-estranging. I think what you do in a remarkable way is give us a kind of log or digest of the psychic life of language learning. I haven't really read anything like it, but I have seen exhibitions more and more, or people working in the art world who are experimenting with language learning as a medium. And both an embodied, physical, and also visual modes of expression.
Yes, I think it would be quite fascinating to expand on that, and there are a couple of passages in the book where I do talk about the tongue and particular elements of the Zulu language which require a different use of the tongue and the mouth to English. And I want to read a couple of pages where it is more to do with the body, but I also want to emphasize that and this is again, well, would I want to take that polemical stand? Is I think there's a way in which I'm arguing that if one looks at the secret history of language in South Africa, there are already instances where one, as a white South African, is learning the language and therefore has the opportunity to see oneself as one is seen by the other. But the example, when I read a couple of pages, will also emphasize I'm influenced so much by Derrida, the prosthetic nature of that language that one takes to be the language of the other. And I'm alluding to monolingualism of the other, the ersatz character of that language, which is mediated through the name of a language predominantly, not entirely, but
Can I ask another question? You mentioned Derrida more than once. You know, Derrida and Hélène Cizot, both Jews in Algeria, they grew up with a certain fondness for their, so I call them nannies, their surrogate mothers. And in fact, Cizot writes an entire series of chapters. I think she was called Aisha, I forget, but very beautiful what Aisha taught her. Not just that, but that the guilt that she associates with not being able to recuse Aisha from her position of subordination outside the house. So in the relationship that Cizot has with Aisha, Aisha is not subordinate, but Cizot recognizes that she has no power to recuse Aisha from that position of subordination. You mentioned a couple of times. And as you mentioned A, you even went to watch Ipitombi with her once and so on. It brought to mind the Zulu, because both of them, both Derrida and Zulu, have written about their relationship with their Arab surrogate mothers. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about A.
Well, I'll summarize what is in the book. A was the person who looked after my sister and me when we were children, and her mother tongue was Xhosa, which is a mutually intelligible language with Zulu. And what I've done in the book is stage the relationship that I remember with her as both a missed opportunity to learn Xhosa, which is her mother tongue, but also an instance of already learning Zulu, which is a mutually intelligible language with Xhosa. So it's again using that example and that memory to complicate the idea that the process of learning this language is something that I still have to do. That in a sense, because of that maternal, Ato is not wrong to call it maternal, and I'll use that word, that relationship. The process of already learning that language is already very, very deep-seated and linked to unconscious processes, which are then repeated at different points later in one's life. Yes, I think it's true in the parallel with the Siksu. I haven't read all of those texts where she's talking about Aisha, but this not being able to recuse her from the devastation.
Recuse her from the devastation that is race relations. Sorry.
Yeah, that there is certainly that sense in some of the memories that I have put into the book, and this is something that I see as having happened too late, because as a young child, what does one know about the larger context of race relations? It was only in my 20s that I discovered that A's community in a particular region that she came from was subject to forced removal, and one of the most egregious cases of forced removal around the establishment of the Siskai Bantustan. And so I think it goes even beyond that conscious sense that, well, I know that I cannot save you from this. It's I don't even know what I cannot save you from, because I'm too young. I don't know enough at that time. So there's always that sense of Nachträglichkeit and deferred action and revision of the memory, which is trying at the same time to do. It's impossible, really. Holding that younger self responsible for something, but not holding it responsible for things that it could not possibly have been aware of. And yes, it's. I do see a resonance with Siksu and her autobiographical writing about Algeria, for sure.
Mark,
I want to make sure that there's time for questions. Did you still want to read?
If I could read 2 pages and then
Sure.
go on for questions, unless Emily,
No,
you want
go
to?
ahead.
I'm terribly tone deaf, and so I'm taking a great risk by reading from these pages because it involves song. But this is from the conspiratorial chapter. Well, there are other conspiratorial sections of the book, but before I read, I think I should just give a vote of thanks to Jane Tylus for hosting this event and being host to Learning Zulu, and of course to Jane's assistants, Gwyneth Mail and Alexandria Martinez, and Chris Alexander at the Humanities Center, and give my thanks also to Emily for her wonderful response, and of course for publishing my book in your distinguished series. And I was very sad to hear you announce the death of Srinivas, a wonderful book that he wrote. It's an honor to be in that company. And of course to Ato for his profound response. It's very moving to have 2 such profound responses to a new book. One never knows how it is going to come across. And thank you, of course, for coming. So this is from the chapter Ipitombi. I'm told that I'm less tone deaf in Zulu. That I can't carry a tune in English, but somehow in Zulu it's better. I don't know if this is true. People tell you things that they may not really be true, but are said to comfort you. Anyway, this is the beginning. I have to sing because the epigraph is from a song, and the text refers to it. Shosholoza, shosholoza, kules ntaba, stimela sipumela, wenu yabaleka, shosholoza, shosholoza. See, you need the 2-part or 3-part harmony. It's a work song, and quite often there would be the leader who would be singing in one key, and the workers in the team of workers would be singing in a different key, so producing that highly contextual 2-part harmony. So this song, which is not attributed to any particular composer, was included in this musical from the 1970s called Ipitombi. I won't say anything more about Ipitombi, but just to read what I say at the beginning of the chapter on Ipitombi. So I think one of the things that I discovered through learning Zulu is that if there's this prosthesis at the origin for me of my own formation, this is this is also to do with one sense of sexual identity, and I'll read this. This is conspiratorial. This book is a very funny book, actually. How to make a Zulu hut. Take an old telephone directory, Yellow Pages or residential, and starting from the first page, fold the top right-hand corner over so that the top edge of the page meets the inner edge to form an isosceles triangle. Left-handed pupils may fold from the top left-hand corner of the second page. The outward side of the triangle forms the hut sloping roof. The lower half of the page presents a straight outer edge. This is the wall of the hut. Fold each page in this fashion. When you are finished, carefully fold the phone book's covers in the same way and staple them together securely back to back. This forms a stable base for the hut once the book is stood on end. Ask each pupil to bring an old phone book from the house. A group of Zulu huts makes for an eye-catching display in which the substandard A or B boy can take pride. Exhibited with other handwork, it brightens up the classroom for parent-teacher evenings. Although I remember the finished product, making a Zulu hut was not something I could remember how to do. Traditions are sometimes lost. So I had to find a knowledgeable informant, and then I had to write myself a set of instructions so I would not forget next time around. But the song, I remember, see above. All I have done is put the words in standard Zulu orthography. How did I come to this song? How did it come to me? How did a little boy growing up in the Cape come to be learning a Zulu? That is what I'm about to tell you. In the classroom where we would run our fingertips down Miss F's back to keep her calm, a collective exercise for the greater good in which I was less adept than others, my caresses not being calming enough, the lift scheme mothers gather to make us up for Ipitombi, which has been chosen as the school play for 1975. Or maybe it was actually 1974, as the school magazine for 1975 has a report on a junior school production of Cinderella, whereas the 1974 magazine makes no mention of any play. Or perhaps it is because ours was one of the pirate productions of Ipitombi that proliferated. Family has intruded in the private, secret space of the schoolroom. The intrusion of family into the school. This is a theme on which I could enlarge. 2 years later, at an evening PTA meeting, my father writes on the blackboard, "Big brother is watching you." The inscription is still there the next day. I have no idea what it means, and my Standard 1 teacher has no idea why my father would have written it there. I am embarrassed. Sometime later that day, it is erased. Was it I who was asked to erase it, as if I had been the culprit? The mascara I allow, but I draw back at the lipstick. It smells and tastes like the kiss of a female relation, or perhaps that is why I shrink from such a kiss. Girls wear lipstick, and I am not a girl. Tonight I am a boy, a Zulu boy. Chilly in my PT shorts, bare from the waist up, I clutch my cardboard assegai and wait for the curtain call. I do not remember the rest of my costume. Maybe there was also a cardboard shield, although I'm certain that we were not in blackface. There is a photograph of me, a little older, in a Purism family dress, a red Indian with grease paint stripes across my rib cage, a headdress of seagull feathers. I wear fawn corduroy pants with a tasseled strip from a box of upholstery offcuts sewn onto the sides. I shake my head at the photograph in Tournez les Mots of a shirtless Jacques Derrida, up in a tree at age 15, bow and arrow in hand, profit de l'artefacteur en jeune singe. What is it about Jewish boys in the colonies? But to be a Red Indian, of which the wish to be was immortally captured by Kafka, is it the same as being a Zulu boy? Provisionally, let me say no, even if either character could be improvised by mother's hands from similar materials. And those hands could even make a boy into a girl, if one is to credit what was said about Cinderella. Finding and making costumes for boys and quote-unquote girls of all shapes and sizes was not as difficult as it seemed at first because of the cooperation of the mothers. This is from the School magazine, 1975. As rehearsed, a drum roll from Mr. J is the cue for our troupe of Zulu boys to ascend the stage. We line up at the very front, the light in our eyes. Behind us, the bigger boys play the leading part, so we never see the show. Did we stamp our feet and dance? Probably, but what I remember is singing Shosholoza because I can remember the words "See above." If there were other songs we sang that night, I have forgotten them. Could it be a screen memory? I doubt it.
I just want to make sure that there's time to go look at Mark's book, so maybe we'll just do a very quick round of questions, 3 or so. The floor is open.
I was just wondering how you decided to structure the book.
Well, once it became apparent to me that I was going to produce a historical narrative of attempts by others to learn Zulu from around 1850 to the present, then I could structure it chronologically as that history or that secret history. And then at certain points, I worked in my own chronology, which is not as presented in as linear fashion as the history. So it was a matter of combining the two so that they would present each other in the sharpest possible relief. But I think I was guided by the idea that there was this history that was something that was there before me, and that I was coming into rather belatedly, but wanted to show that.
I'm just curious if you mentioned Johnny Clegg's experience with learning Zulu in your book.
Yes, I have gone into Johnny Clegg's experience in quite a lot of detail in the same chapter as Ipitombi, and in a way, he's the counterpoint to Ipitombi as an ersatz musical, purportedly Zulu dance and so on, where Johnny Clegg became fluent in Zulu, and took part in Zulu dance competitions from the age of 13 or 14, and so it carries immense authority. And fortunately, Johnny Clegg also is extremely effusive and self-reflexive in interviews about his own experience. Yeah, it's an important part of the book. Yeah, I think you were first. Yeah.
Now that the book is finished and you finished writing it, and I suppose there's a resurgence in your mind and your sort of interpretation of your relationship to the language, but how do you deal with the question of forgetting language, which is something that happens with languages that aren't one's own first language? What is, I mean, in a way, the question is, what is your relationship to Zulu now that the book is finished and you're not thinking about your relationship to Zulu?
Well, I keep thinking that I've completely forgotten the language because I don't get to speak it very much in New York City. So I keep thinking, oh, I've forgotten it. But I sent a copy of my book to Exon, who you know, my Zulu teacher, a New York Zulu teacher, today, and I composed a brief note to him in Zulu, and I was surprised by just how, at least in my writing, I was being fairly, not only fairly grammatical, but fairly idiomatic too. So I surprised myself today. I didn't expect that. So it's, I think one has to trust, and I have to trust that it's somewhere there. You may not be drawing on everything you need right away, but I think once you start speaking and writing and listening, that what you had will come back. Yeah. Nanda.
So one of the really interesting moments tonight is when you started singing, and then your voice found an echo, right, with some other people here in the audience, which was an interesting counterpoint, right, to the confessed inability of the other panelists, which I share, of their inability to pronounce many of the names. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about, to be a little bit cute here, the resonance that you hope this book to have with various different audiences, which is, I guess, another way of asking, who did you write this book for? And how did you write it differently for those different constituencies? The people who can echo Zulu to you back and those who can't.
Well, I think and it's an impossible question to answer, really. Who did I write it for? I think my favorite answer to that impossible question is that I wrote it for readers who are able to detect the silences in the book. What is not stated, what is elided, what is alluded to in passing, but which is of central importance to it. But that's my favorite answer. Of course, the book is written for anyone who's tried to learn a language and found frustration, but also success in doing that. And so I think learning a language, and most people have tried to learn a language other than their mother tongue. Most people have, and some have succeeded in learning more than one. And so I think that the book appealed to most people who've tried to do that. It speaks quite loudly and to that experience, even if the history is a specific history. If I compare what I've written to Jhumpa Lahiri's book, where she's writing about learning Italian, it's clear that her sense of her own reasons for learning Italian are very, very different to mine, because the history that she sees as inscribing her, and it's only really mentioned very briefly in her book, is so utterly different. That learning Italian for her is not associated with historical imperative that comes down from the 1850s and the missionaries, and is a way of making good for colonial wrong. So I think that's why Jhumpa Lahiri's book is so interesting to me, because it's different. It's even if most of us have tried to learn another language, each of our histories is different, and therefore our motivations, insofar as they're overdetermined in some way by that history, have to be utterly different.
Please join me in thanking Mark and Emily and Ato.